The woman had always lived a quiet and simple life, far away from attention or fame. She was the kind of person who preferred silence over noise and routine over excitement. Every day followed a gentle pattern. She would wake up early in the morning, take care of her small home, and spend most of her time in peaceful activities. Music had always been a part of her life, but not in a way that others noticed. It was something personal, something she kept close to her heart like a secret only she understood. From a young age, she had been drawn to the piano. She did not learn it in a grand music school or under famous teachers. Instead, her learning came from patience, observation, and long hours of practice whenever she could find time. Sometimes she would play softly at night when the world was asleep. The sound of the piano keys became her comfort, a way to express emotions she could not speak out loud. She never thought of performing in front of people. To her, music was never about attention. It was about feeling. Life, however, does not always stay the same. One ordinary afternoon, something unexpected happened. She received an invitation to take part in a small cultural event in the city. It was not a big or famous event, just a local gathering where different people would perform simple acts of music, poetry, and art. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She had never performed publicly, and she was not known by anyone in such circles. But the message was clear. They wanted her to come and play the piano for a short segment. The invitation was polite but very specific. It mentioned that the performance would be simple, nothing complicated or emotional. Just a light piano tune to fill the background and create a calm atmosphere for the audience. The organizers did not expect anything extraordinary. In fact, they made it sound like they only needed someone to play quietly while people moved around and talked. This part stayed in her mind longer than anything else. Simple tune. Nothing special. Just background music. She sat alone that evening thinking about it. The idea of stepping in front of strangers made her uncomfortable. She was not used to being seen or judged. Her life had always been private. But something inside her also felt a quiet curiosity. Maybe it was time to step out of her comfort zone, even if only for a few minutes. After all, it was just a simple tune. Nothing difficult. Nothing that would put her under pressure, or so she believed. The next few days passed slowly. She prepared in her own way, without telling many people around her. She practiced the same soft melodies she had played for years. Each note felt familiar, like an old friend. Still, she kept reminding herself that this was not a big performance. She was told not to make it dramatic or emotional, just simple playing. That instruction stayed with her, repeating in her thoughts again and again. As the day of the event came closer, she started to feel a strange mix of calm and nervousness. It was not fear exactly, but more like stepping into something unknown. She wondered what kind of people would be there. Would they even listen? Would they care at all? Or would she just be another unnoticed presence in a crowded room? These thoughts stayed with her, but she tried to push them away and focus on the task she had agreed to do. On the morning of the event, she woke up earlier than usual. The sky was soft and bright, and the air felt different, almost like it was marking a change in her life. She prepared herself quietly, choosing simple clothes that would not draw attention. She did not want to stand out. She only wanted to complete what she had been invited for and return home without any disturbance. The journey to the venue was long enough for her to think more deeply. As the surroundings changed from quiet streets to busy roads, she observed people rushing with their own lives, each one focused on something different. She felt like she was entering a world that was not entirely hers. Still, she remained composed. She reminded herself again that it was just a simple piano tune. Nothing more. When she finally reached the venue, she paused for a moment outside the entrance. The building was larger than she had expected. Soft music could already be heard from inside, mixed with the sound of conversations. People were arriving in groups, dressed neatly, talking and laughing. The atmosphere felt formal yet casual at the same time. It was clear that this was not a place where she usually belonged. She stepped inside slowly. No one paid much attention to her arrival. That was expected. She moved quietly through the hall, following the directions given to her. Along the way, She noticed different performers warming up, some confident, some nervous, some surrounded by friends or supporters. She stayed alone, observing everything without drawing attention. A small waiting area was assigned for performers. She sat there, keeping her hands folded, listening to the sounds around her. Occasionally, she heard names being called one by one for different performances. Each announcement made her aware that her turn would eventually come. Still, she tried not to think too much about it. While waiting, she overheard small pieces of conversation from nearby people. Some were discussing performances, others were talking about their expectations for the event. A few comments were casual, but she could sense that many did not expect much from unknown participants. It did not hurt her, but it reminded her of the instructions she had been given. Keep it simple, nothing special. Time seemed to move slowly in that waiting space. Every passing minute made her more aware of her surroundings. The sound of footsteps, the distant applause from earlier performances, the soft tuning of instruments. All of it blended together. She took a deep breath and tried to calm her thoughts. Her fingers lightly moved as if silently practicing on an invisible piano. Eventually, she was informed that her turn would come soon. A staff member approached and politely told her to prepare. The moment felt real now. There was no turning back. She nodded gently, showing no outward nervousness, even though inside her mind was beginning to feel heavier. She stood up slowly and walked toward the performance area. Each step felt like entering a different space, one where everything could change in just a few minutes. The audience was already seated, waiting for the next act. She was about to be introduced not as someone important, but as just another performer expected to play something simple. As she stood behind the stage curtain, she looked at her hands one last time. They were steady, but her thoughts were not entirely calm. Still, she reminded herself again. Just a simple piano tune. Nothing more. That was what she had been told. That was what everyone expected. And with that thought, she prepared to step forward into the moment that would quietly begin to change everything, even though she did not yet know it. As she stepped closer to the performance area, the atmosphere around her slowly began to feel heavier. The quiet confidence she had tried to build on her way here started to fade a little, replaced by a calm but uncertain feeling. The hall was bigger than she had first imagined from outside. Bright lights covered the stage area, and rows of chairs were filled with people waiting for the next performance. Some were talking softly, others were watching the stage with mild interest, and a few were simply looking at their phones, passing time. She stood behind the side curtain, waiting for her name to be called. From where she was standing, she could hear the faint sound of the previous performance ending. There was polite applause, nothing too loud or excited, just enough to show respect. The sound slowly faded, leaving a small silence that made her even more aware of her own presence in that space. A staff member quietly checked the stage and then came back to guide her. There was no special introduction for her, no long announcement. It was just a simple nod, as if reminding her that it was time to go. She followed without speaking much. Her steps were steady, but inside her, thoughts were moving faster than usual. She kept repeating the same idea in her mind. It is just a simple tune. Nothing complicated, just as they asked. As she walked closer to the piano placed on stage, she finally saw the full audience clearly. The lights made it difficult to see individual faces, but she could still sense their presence. Many people were sitting comfortably, waiting for entertainment. Some looked curious, but most looked like they were expecting something ordinary. There was no excitement in the air for her performance, only quiet waiting. She noticed a few people near the front rows whispering to each other. It was not loud enough for her to hear the words, but the expressions on their faces made it clear that they were not expecting much. A simple performer for a simple tune. That seemed to be the general assumption. She did not react. She had learned long ago not to let outside judgment affect her focus. The piano was placed in the center of the stage. It looked polished and formal under the lights. She approached it slowly and stood for a brief moment before sitting down. That small pause felt longer than it actually was. In that moment, she could feel every sound in the hall. Even the smallest movement from the audience seemed louder than usual. She placed her hands gently above the keys. Her fingers were slightly cold, but they were steady. She took a slow breath, trying to calm her mind completely. The instructions she had been given kept echoing in her thoughts. Keep it simple. Nothing dramatic. Just background music. Those words had followed her all the way here, and now they felt heavier than before. The room became quiet as people slowly turned their attention toward her. It was not a strong silence, but a waiting silence, the kind that comes before something begins. She could feel that attention even without seeing faces clearly. It made her slightly more aware of every movement she would make. She looked down at the piano keys for a moment. They were familiar to her in a way that felt almost comforting. No matter where she went, the piano always felt like a place where she could speak without words. But today felt different. Today she was not playing for herself. She was playing for strangers who expected very little from her. A small signal came from the side of the stage. It was time to begin. She nodded slightly, not to anyone in particular, but as a quiet agreement with herself. Then she pressed the first key. The sound that followed was soft and simple, just as expected. A gentle melody filled the hall, light and calm. It was nothing surprising. It blended into the atmosphere like background music in a quiet room. Some people adjusted in their seats, relaxing further, thinking it would be a short and ordinary performance. Her hands moved slowly and carefully. Each note was placed with attention, but without any extra emotion shown outwardly. From the audience's point of view, it looked like a simple, peaceful tune being played by someone who was following instructions exactly. There was no drama, no sudden change, no visible effort beyond basic playing. A few people in the audience began to lose focus. Some leaned back in their chairs, others looked away for a moment. The kind of response was exactly what had been expected. It was just background music, nothing more. The hall remained calm, filled with soft attention but no strong reaction. She continued playing, her expression calm and controlled. But inside her, something subtle was beginning to shift. Not in a dramatic way but in a quiet internal feeling. The piano had always been more than just notes to her. It carried emotions she had never spoken out loud. Even though she had been told to keep it simple, her hands seemed to remember more than instructions. As she moved from one phrase to another, the melody began to feel slightly different. Not to the audience at first, but to her. There was a deeper rhythm forming quietly under the surface. It was as if something inside her was slowly waking up, something that had been quiet for a long time. Still, she tried to stay within the limits she had been given. She did not want to break the expectation placed on her. But music does not always follow strict rules when it comes from the heart. The piano responded to her emotions in ways she could not fully control. Each note began to carry a little more weight, a little more depth. In the audience, attention slowly started to shift again. A few people who had looked away now turned back toward the stage. They were not sure why, but something about the sound was beginning to feel different. It was still soft, still controlled, but it was no longer just background noise. She kept playing, unaware of how the perception of her performance was beginning to change. Her focus remained on the keys, but her expression had become slightly more absorbed. It was no longer just about following instructions. It was becoming something deeper, something that could not be easily explained. The hall, which had been casual and distracted only moments ago, now felt slightly more attentive. People were beginning to listen without realizing it. Not because the performance had become loud or dramatic, but because something about it was slowly pulling their attention back. And she, still sitting at the piano, had not yet realized that the simple tune she was told to play was quietly starting to become something far beyond what anyone had expected. The soft sound of the piano continued to flow through the hall, but now it was no longer just a simple background tune. Something subtle had begun to change, even if most people could not clearly understand what it was at first. The woman still sat calmly at the piano, her posture steady, her eyes focused on the keys, but inside her, something deeper was slowly unfolding. The audience, which had been only casually attentive before, started to shift their attention more clearly toward the stage. It was not sudden or dramatic. It happened slowly, like a gentle pull that people did not immediately notice. A few heads that had been turned away now faced forward again. Conversations that had been going on quietly began to fade. The room was still not fully silent, but it was becoming more focused. She continued playing, moving her fingers with a quiet confidence that came from years of private practice. Each note still followed a simple structure on the surface, but something underneath was beginning to feel different. The melody had started to carry a kind of softness that was not just about sound, but about emotion. It was as if the piano was slowly beginning to speak in a language that reached beyond instructions. In the early moments of her performance, she had been careful to stay within the limits she was given. She remembered clearly the words that had been told to her. Keep it simple. Nothing emotional. Just background music. But as she continued playing, those instructions started to feel distant. Not ignored, but quietly overshadowed by something more natural taking place within her. The hall lighting reflected softly off the piano surface. From a distance, it looked like a calm and controlled scene. A performer doing exactly what was expected. But if someone paid closer attention, they might have noticed that her hands were not simply repeating practice. There was a flow developing that felt more expressive, more human. A few people in the audience leaned slightly forward in their seats without even realizing it. It was not a conscious reaction. It was something the music was doing to them. The melody was still gentle, but it now carried small changes in tone and rhythm that made it feel more alive. It was no longer just something to hear. It was something to feel. She did not look at the audience. Her attention remained on the piano. For her, this was still a moment of focus, not performance. She was not thinking about impressing anyone. She was simply letting her hands move the way they naturally wanted to move. And slowly, without her fully realizing it, the music was becoming something more than she had intended. In the middle rows of the hall, a few people exchanged brief glances. There was no need for words between them. Something about the performance had changed, but they could not easily explain what it was. It was still quiet, still soft, but it was no longer ordinary. It had begun to hold attention in a way that simple background music never could. The woman's fingers moved with a gentle rhythm that now felt more connected, more layered. Each note seemed to carry a small piece of emotion that blended into the next. It was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual deepening. Like water slowly becoming deeper the further one moves into it without noticing. At the edge of the stage, a staff member who had initially been focused on timing and coordination now paused for a moment. Even they could sense that something was different. The instructions had been clear before the performance began, but what was happening now was not something that fit neatly into those instructions. Still, there was no interruption. The music was continuing smoothly, and the audience was becoming more engaged. She adjusted her hands slightly, moving into a new phrase. This part of the melody felt more open, more expressive. It was as if something inside her had quietly decided to step forward without permission. Not in rebellion, but in natural expression. The piano responded to her emotions in a way that felt almost like conversation. A few people in the audience who had been distracted earlier now looked fully toward the stage. Their expressions changed subtly. There was curiosity, then quiet interest, and slowly something deeper. The performance was no longer something to pass time with. It was becoming something to listen to carefully. The woman herself remained unaware of how the room was responding. In her mind, she was still following the structure she had been told to play. But emotion cannot always be separated cleanly from music. It begins to flow through even the simplest patterns when played with sincerity. The melody gently shifted again. Still simple, still soft, but now carrying more depth. It felt like a story being told without words. Not a dramatic story, but a quiet one. A story of patience, of hidden feelings, of things left unspoken. The kind of emotions that exist in everyday life but are rarely shared openly. In the back of the hall, a few people who had not been paying attention before now stopped moving altogether. They were no longer distracted. Their focus had been captured without them realizing when it happened. That was the quiet power of what was unfolding. The woman's expression remained composed, but there was a slight change in her presence. Not in appearance, but in energy. She was no longer just executing a simple task. She was now inside the music in a deeper way, as if the piano had become an extension of her thoughts. The sound filled the hall more completely now. It was still gentle, but it had grown in emotional weight. The kind of sound that does not demand attention loudly, but earns it quietly. People were no longer casually observing. They were listening. A few small reactions began to appear in the audience. Not applause or noise, but subtle signs of emotional connection. A hand resting still instead of moving. A head slightly tilted forward. Eyes fixed on the stage without distraction. These were small changes, but they showed that something was reaching them. She continued to play, unaware that she was crossing a line that had not been visible at the start. What was supposed to remain simple was now becoming something deeply expressive. Not because she intended it, but because emotion often finds its way through when it is present long enough. The melody began to rise slightly in intensity, still within a soft range, but now carrying a sense of direction. It was no longer just floating. It was moving somewhere. The audience could feel that change even if they could not describe it clearly. And in that moment, without any announcement or warning, the entire atmosphere inside the hall had begun to transform quietly, one note at a time. The atmosphere inside the hall had already started to change, even though most people could not fully understand when or how it happened. What began as a simple background performance had slowly turned into something more meaningful, something that was quietly pulling attention toward the stage. The woman remained seated at the piano, her posture steady, her focus still directed toward the keys in front of her. She did not look up. She did not react to the audience. She simply continued playing. The melody had now grown deeper, though still gentle in volume. It carried a kind of emotional weight that was not obvious at first but became stronger the longer it continued. Each note seemed to connect with the next in a way that felt natural, almost like a flowing conversation. It was no longer just a sequence of simple instructions. It was becoming something that felt alive. In the audience, more people were now paying attention without realizing when their focus had shifted. A few who had been sitting back casually were now leaning slightly forward. Some who had been distracted earlier had completely turned their attention toward the stage. The change was not loud or sudden. It was quiet, like a soft pull that slowly grew stronger. The woman's fingers moved across the piano keys with calm control, but there was also something more expressive in her movement now. It was subtle, not dramatic. She was not performing for attention or approval. She was simply letting the music flow in a way that felt right in the moment. The instructions she had been given earlier still existed in her memory, but they no longer felt like limits. They felt distant. The lighting above the stage remained soft and warm, highlighting her presence without making it appear exaggerated. From the audience's perspective, she looked calm and composed, almost as if she had always belonged there. But internally, something deeper was unfolding. The music had begun to connect with parts of her that were rarely expressed in daily life. In the middle rows, a few people exchanged quiet looks again. This time, there was no confusion in their expressions. Instead, there was curiosity mixed with something closer to emotional recognition. The performance had started to feel less like entertainment and more like a shared experience. Something that could not be easily described in words. The melody shifted slightly once more. It was still built on simplicity, but now it carried layers of feeling that made it richer. It was like hearing the same path but noticing new details along the way. The sound was not louder, yet it felt stronger. It did not demand attention, but it held it firmly. A quiet stillness began to settle over the hall. Not complete silence, but a kind of respectful quiet where even small sounds felt noticeable. Conversations faded almost completely. Movements slowed. People were no longer casually observing. They were listening with intent. The woman remained unaware of the full effect her performance was having. In her mind, she was still focused on playing the piece as it continued to unfold. But emotion has a way of shaping music even when it is not consciously directed. Every small feeling she carried within her seemed to find its way into the notes. The piano responded softly under her hands. The instrument no longer felt like a separate object. It felt like a space where thoughts could take shape without words. The sound it produced now carried something more personal, something that could not be separated from the person playing it. In the audience, a few individuals felt a slight shift in their own emotions. It was not dramatic or overwhelming. It was quiet and gradual. A sense of reflection began to appear, the kind that comes when something familiar suddenly feels deeper than expected. Some people sat very still, as if afraid that even small movement might break the moment. The melody rose gently again, not in volume, but in emotional depth. It felt like it was moving through different layers of feeling. At one moment it carried softness. At another, it carried quiet strength. There was a balance in it that made it feel complete without needing anything extra. The woman's expression remained calm, but there was a slight softness in her face that matched the music more closely now. She was not thinking about the audience. She was not thinking about expectations. She was simply inside the moment, fully connected to what her hands were creating. At the side of the stage, the staff members who had been managing the program quietly watched without interrupting. The performance had gone beyond what was originally planned, but there was no reason to stop it. Something about it felt too natural, too meaningful to cut short. It was no longer just part of a schedule. It had become something that was unfolding on its own. The audience continued to change slowly in their response. A few more people stopped adjusting in their seats. Their attention had fully settled on the stage. The music was no longer something in the background of their thoughts. It had become the main focus of the room. The melody now carried a sense of depth that felt almost like storytelling without words. It was not telling a single clear story, but rather many small feelings combined together. It reminded people of quiet moments in life, of memories that are not often spoken about, of emotions that exist but are rarely expressed. The woman's hands moved with a steady rhythm, but there was also flexibility in her playing now. It was no longer strictly controlled. It had become more natural, more expressive. Each movement felt connected to the previous one, like thoughts flowing one after another without interruption. A soft emotional tension began to build in the hall, not uncomfortable, but noticeable. It was the kind of feeling that comes when something deeply human is being shared without words. People were not just hearing the music anymore. They were feeling it in their own way. The lighting, the silence, the stillness of the audience, and the gentle sound of the piano all came together in a single moment that felt unified. Nothing was separate anymore. Everything seemed connected to the performance in some way. The woman still did not realize how much had changed since she first sat down at the piano. In her mind, she had simply begun a simple tune as requested. But what was happening now had moved far beyond that original instruction. The music had grown into something larger, shaped by emotion and presence. A few audience members lowered their gaze slightly, not out of distraction, but out of reflection. Others kept watching the stage closely, as if afraid to miss even a single note. The atmosphere was now fully engaged, but in a quiet and respectful way. The melody continued to unfold gently, carrying the hall deeper into its emotional flow. It was still simple in structure, but its impact was no longer simple at all. It had become something that stayed with people even as it played. And in that steady flow of sound, the hall remained completely transformed from what it had been just moments before, without anyone needing to say a single word. The hall had become unusually still, not in a forced way, but in a natural silence that grows when people are deeply absorbed in something happening in front of them. The piano continued to speak through its soft, flowing notes, and the woman remained seated, unaware of how much the atmosphere around her had changed since the beginning of her performance. What had started as a simple instruction had now turned into something far more emotional. The melody was no longer just background sound. It had become the center of attention, gently holding the entire room in its grip without any effort or force. People were no longer shifting in their seats or looking away. Their focus had fully settled on the stage. The woman's hands moved with quiet confidence. She was not rushing, not forcing anything. Each note felt natural, like it belonged exactly where it was being placed. There was a calm rhythm in her movements, but also a growing depth in the sound. It was as if the music was slowly opening up more of itself with every passing moment. In the audience, emotions were beginning to surface in subtle ways. Some people kept their eyes fixed on the performer, as if trying to understand how a simple tune could feel so different now. Others sat very still, almost as if they were afraid that even a small sound or movement might break the moment they were experiencing. A few listeners felt something personal rising inside them. Not something dramatic, but quiet memories or thoughts they had not focused on in a long time. The music seemed to gently touch those hidden places without asking for permission. It was not loud or overwhelming. It was soft, but deeply present. The woman herself remained fully focused on the piano. She was not thinking about the reaction of the audience. She was not measuring how well she was performing. She was simply allowing her fingers to follow the flow that felt natural to her. The music had become a space where she could express what words never carried. As the melody continued, it began to carry a stronger emotional shape. It still remained simple in structure, but it now had layers that made it feel rich and meaningful. Each section of the tune seemed to reflect a different feeling, moving gently from softness to depth and back again. The audience was now completely engaged. Even those who had entered the hall without any expectations were now fully drawn into the performance. There was no distraction anymore. No side conversations. No wandering attention. Everything had quietly centered on the stage. The lighting above the piano created a calm glow around the performer. It made the scene feel almost timeless, as if the moment existed outside of ordinary routine. The combination of silence, music, and focus created an atmosphere that felt deeply human and personal. The woman's expression remained composed, but there was a slight change in her presence. She looked more connected to the music than before, not in a dramatic way but in a natural, flowing sense. It was as if she and the piano were no longer separate, but part of the same expression. In the middle rows, someone gently wiped their eyes without saying anything. It was not a loud reaction, not something that drew attention. It was quiet and personal. Others around them continued to listen in stillness, each person experiencing the moment in their own private way. The melody rose gently again, still soft, but now carrying a sense of emotional fullness. It was not building toward something loud or dramatic. Instead, it felt like it was revealing something hidden, slowly and carefully. The kind of sound that does not need intensity to make an impact. The woman's fingers moved with increasing ease, as if she had fully entered the space of the music. There was no hesitation in her movements now. Everything felt connected and smooth. The piano responded to her touch like it understood her completely. The audience remained quiet, but their stillness was no longer passive. It was active listening. They were not just hearing notes anymore. They were experiencing something that felt meaningful, something that could not easily be explained in simple words. The emotional tone of the performance continued to deepen. It was not sadness alone, nor happiness alone. It was a mixture of feelings that reflected real life in a quiet way. Moments of hope, reflection, memory, and peace all seemed to blend together within the music. A few people leaned slightly forward again, not because they needed to see better, but because they were fully drawn into what they were hearing. The music seemed to hold them in place gently, without pressure, simply through emotional connection. The woman did not notice any of these reactions directly. She was still inside her own focus, fully absorbed in the act of playing. The world around her had become secondary to the flow of the music. It was just her and the piano, moving together through a shared rhythm. At the edge of the stage, a staff member stood quietly, observing. There was no attempt to interrupt or guide the performance anymore. Something about it felt complete in its own way, as if it needed to unfold naturally without interference. The melody shifted once more, this time carrying a softer, almost reflective tone. It felt like the music was slowing down emotionally, allowing space for everything that had been expressed to settle gently in the air. The hall remained silent, but it was a silence filled with meaning. Some audience members closed their eyes briefly, not to disconnect, but to feel the music more deeply. It was no longer about watching a performance. It was about experiencing something internal, something that resonated differently for each person. The woman's hands continued their steady movement across the keys. There was no sign of struggle or effort. Everything felt natural, as if the music had already been living inside her and was now simply being allowed to flow outward. The atmosphere in the hall had completely transformed from what it was at the beginning. What once felt like a casual event had now become something emotionally engaging, something that held attention without needing explanation. The melody softened slightly again, not losing its depth, but becoming more gentle. It felt like the music was slowly preparing to transition, as if reaching a point of quiet reflection. The audience remained fully engaged, waiting without expectation, simply present in the moment. The woman continued playing, still unaware of the full emotional impact she was creating. For her, it was still about following the flow of the music. But for everyone listening, it had become something far more meaningful than a simple tune. And as the final part of this segment of music began to take shape, the entire hall remained in a shared silence filled with emotion, waiting for what would come next, without needing anything more than the moment itself. The final movement of the music began to unfold slowly, almost like a soft breath released into the room. The hall was still completely quiet, but it was no longer an empty silence. It was full of feeling, as if every person present was holding something inside their chest that they could not easily express. The woman remained seated at the piano, her hands still moving gently across the keys, unaware that the moment had already become something unforgettable for everyone listening. The melody had reached a deeper place now. It was no longer just flowing in simple patterns. It carried a sense of completion, like a journey that had quietly moved through different emotions and was now finding its way toward an ending. The sound was soft, but it carried weight. Each note felt like a small memory being placed carefully in time. In the audience, people were no longer simply watching or listening. They were experiencing something personal. Some sat completely still, their eyes fixed on the stage. Others had lowered their gaze slightly, as if reflecting on something inside themselves. A few people quietly pressed their hands together, not in applause, but in silent emotion. The woman's expression remained calm, but there was a subtle change in her presence. She was no longer just playing a piece of music. She had become fully connected to it. Every movement of her fingers felt natural, almost like breathing. There was no hesitation, no interruption, only flow. The piano sound filled the hall gently, wrapping around every corner of the space. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was everywhere. It felt close even to those sitting far from the stage. The music had created a shared moment that connected everyone without words. A few audience members felt their eyes become heavy with emotion, not because of sadness alone, but because something inside them had been touched in a quiet way. The performance had not spoken directly, yet it had reached places that words often fail to reach. The melody began to slow slightly, not stopping but becoming more delicate, more careful. It was as if the music itself understood that it was approaching its final moments. Each note was placed with gentle care, like someone walking slowly through a meaningful memory. The woman did not rush. She allowed the music to move at its own pace. Her hands followed naturally, guided by feeling rather than thought. She was fully inside the moment now, unaware of time, unaware of expectation. Only the piano and the sound existed for her. In the hall, the atmosphere had completely changed from the beginning of the performance. What had once been casual and indifferent was now deeply focused and emotionally present. There was no distraction left, no side movement, only attention. The melody softened even more. It began to feel like a gentle farewell, not an ending that demanded attention, but one that quietly accepted its own completion. The sound lingered in the air slightly longer between notes, allowing space for reflection. Some people in the audience closed their eyes for a moment. They were not trying to avoid the performance. They were absorbing it more deeply. The music had become something they could feel more clearly when they were not watching, but simply listening. The woman's posture remained steady, but there was a softness in her movements now. Everything she played carried a sense of care. It was as if she understood, even without fully realizing it, that this moment held meaning far beyond what was originally intended. The final section of the melody began to form. It was gentle and simple, but it carried a deep emotional weight. Each note seemed to echo slightly longer in the hall, as if the space itself was holding on to the sound. In the audience, a quiet emotional shift spread through the room. It was not sudden. It happened slowly, person by person. A few people blinked more than usual. Others sat very still, their attention completely absorbed. The feeling was shared, but experienced differently by each individual. The woman continued playing with calm focus. Her fingers moved with quiet certainty. There was no struggle, no tension, only flow. The piano responded softly under her touch, producing a sound that felt both simple and deeply expressive at the same time. The melody began to gently descend, like a soft path leading downward into silence. It was not losing strength, but returning to stillness. The hall felt like it was breathing with the music, rising and falling with each phrase. A few people in the audience subtly pressed their lips together, holding back emotion. Others sat with their hands still, completely motionless. The connection between performer and audience had become unspoken but strong. The woman was now in the final moments of the piece. Her expression remained peaceful. There was no awareness of applause or reaction in her mind. Only the music existed. Each final note felt like it belonged exactly where it was placed. The melody reached its softest point. The sound became lighter, almost like a whisper in the air. There was a sense of closure forming naturally, without force. The hall felt suspended in that final emotional space. Then slowly the last notes arrived. They were simple but filled with quiet depth. The final sound lingered gently, refusing to disappear immediately. It stayed in the air for a moment, as if giving the audience time to fully feel it. And then silence. Not an empty silence, but a complete one. A silence that held everything that had just been felt. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire hall was still processing what had just happened. The woman's hands rested gently on the piano keys for a moment longer. She did not move immediately. She remained still, as if also listening to the silence that followed her final note. Then something changed in the room. A single clap sounded softly from somewhere in the audience. Then another, and another, slowly at first, like scattered drops of rain. Then it began to grow. Applause spread across the hall, rising steadily. It was not rushed or noisy. It was heartfelt. People stood one by one without needing instruction. The applause filled the space, not as noise, but as appreciation that came from deep within. The woman slowly lifted her hands from the piano. She looked down for a moment, as if trying to understand what was happening. Her expression remained humble, almost uncertain. She had not expected this response. She had only played what she was asked to play. But the audience knew something she did not fully realize yet. What they had just experienced was not a simple performance. It was something that had touched them in a personal way. The applause continued, growing stronger, yet still respectful. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others simply stood quietly, clapping with steady hands, unable to express their feelings in any other way. The woman finally stood from the piano. She gave a small, respectful gesture toward the audience. Not dramatic, not proud, just simple acknowledgement. She then stepped slightly away from the instrument. The sound of applause continued to fill the hall, but now it felt like a closing chapter rather than a reaction. The moment had already happened. It had already changed something in everyone present. As she walked slowly away from the stage, she did not fully understand the impact she had created. To her, it had been just a simple tune that grew naturally. But to the audience, it had become something they would remember for a long time. And as the sound of applause slowly continued behind her, the hall carried the memory of a performance that began as something simple, but ended as something deeply unforgettable.